The dust swirled through Millbrook's main street like ghosts of better days, carried by a wind that seemed to whisper of forgotten dreams. The town had seen its prime during the gold rush of '68, but now, in the autumn of 1874, it was little more than a collection of weathered buildings and weathered souls, clinging to existence in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. Martha Jenkins stood on the wooden platform that usually served for announcing town meetings, her hands bound behind her back, a coarse burlap sack pulled over her head. The fabric smelled of grain and desperation. Through the rough weave, she could make out the blurred shapes of the crowd that had gathered, not out of curiosity, but out of the same morbid fascination that drew people to watch a hanging. "What am I bid for this here woman?" Sheriff Coleman's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. His beer belly strained against his vest as he gestured toward Martha with all the ceremony of a man selling livestock. "She's strong enough for field work, can cook and clean. Perfect for any man needing help around his property." Martha's breath came in short, panicked gasps inside the suffocating sack. 6 months ago, she had been a schoolteacher in Denver, respected and independent. Then came the accusation. Theft from the school fund planted evidence that she couldn't fight against. The railroad baron's son wanted her land for his expansion, and when she refused to sell, he had found another way to take everything from her. 50 cents! Called out Jake Morrison, the blacksmith, his voice thick with whiskey despite the early hour. 60! Counted old Pete from the general store, more out of habit than genuine interest. Martha felt the platform sway slightly beneath her feet. The humiliation burned hotter than the morning sun beginning to beat down on her dark hair beneath the sack. She had always prided herself on her dignity, her education, her ability to stand on her own 2 feet. Now she was being sold like cattle, reduced to nothing more than a commodity. 75 cents, Pete called again, but his voice carried the boredom of a man going through the motions. The crowd began to thin as the novelty wore off. Martha heard footsteps shuffling away, conversations turning to more mundane matters. The weather, the failing crops, the railroad that might or might not ever reach their forgotten corner of Colorado territory. "Going once." Sheriff Coleman's voice carried a note of impatience. He had other business to attend to, and this circus had gone on long enough. $1. The voice was different from the others, deeper, quieter, but it carried across the square like a rifle shot. Martha felt her heart skip. There was something in that voice, something that didn't belong to the collection of broken men who had been bidding on her like she was a piece of farm equipment. $1 from the stranger, Sheriff Coleman announced, squinting toward the back of the crowd. Going once, going twice. Through the burlap, Martha could see a tall figure step forward. Even with her limited vision, she could tell he moved differently than the other men, purposeful, controlled, like a man who had faced real danger and survived it. Sold to... The sheriff paused, realizing he didn't know the buyer's name. That's when it happened. Instead of claiming his purchase, the stranger did something that no one expected. His voice, when it came, was gentle but firm, cutting through the murmur of the dispersing crowd with the force of absolute conviction. "What's your name?" The question hung in the air like a church bell's toll. Martha felt tears spring to her eyes beneath the sack. In all the months since her world had collapsed, through the trial, the jail cell, the transport to this godforsaken town, no one had asked her name. She had become the woman, the prisoner, the theft suspect, everything except who she really was. "I'm talking to you," the stranger said, his voice carrying clearly across the platform. "The woman in the sack. What's your name?" Sheriff Coleman started to object. "Now see here, mister, you bought her fair and square. She's your property now and—" "No!" The word came out like a gunshot. "No one is anyone's property, and everyone deserves to be called by their name." Martha felt her knees tremble. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the square, it carried like a prayer. "Martha, Martha Jenkins." The stranger stepped closer to the platform. Through the rough burlap, Martha could make out broad shoulders, dark hair, and something else, scars along his hands that spoke of hard work and harder battles. "Well, Miss Martha Jenkins," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "My name is Samuel Reed, and I think it's about time we got that sack off your head." As his calloused but gentle hands reached up to remove the burlap covering, Martha caught her first clear glimpse of the man who had just changed everything. Samuel Reed had the kind of face that had seen too much, weathered by sun and wind, marked by a thin scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. But his eyes were the color of spring sky, clear and honest and kind. The crowd had fallen completely silent now, sensing that something had shifted, that this wasn't going according to the script they all knew by heart. Sheriff Coleman started to speak again, but Samuel's steady gaze silenced him. "Miss Jenkins," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of a promise, "I believe you and I need to have a conversation." The Golden Nugget Saloon wasn't much to look at. Warped wooden floors, mismatched chairs, and windows so grimy they barely let in the afternoon light. But it was the only place in Millbrook where a man could sit down with a woman without causing a scandal, provided they kept to the corner table and minded their own business. Martha sat across from Samuel Reed, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She had cleaned up as best she could at the boarding house where Samuel had secured her a room, but she still felt the phantom weight of that burlap sack, still felt the eyes of the crowd on her. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, not meeting his gaze. "Spend your money on me." Samuel turned his own coffee cup in slow circles on the scarred wooden table. Up close, Martha could see more details about the man who had literally bought her freedom. His clothes were well made but worn, the kind a man bought when he had money and kept when he didn't. His hands were those of a working man, scarred, calloused, but clean. And there was something in the way he carried himself that spoke of discipline, of training. "Where I come from," he said finally, "a person's worth isn't determined by what someone else is willing to pay for them. And where is that? Where you come from?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring out the dirty window toward the mountains. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "I was a soldier, Union Army, 14th Colorado Infantry. We saw action at Glorieta Pass, and later they sent us to Sand Creek." He paused, his jaw tightening. "You know about Sand Creek?" Martha nodded. Everyone in Colorado Territory knew about Sand Creek, though most people didn't like to talk about it. The massacre of Cheyenne and Arapaho people by Colorado militia in '64 was a stain that wouldn't wash clean. "I wasn't militia," Samuel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was regular army, but we were there, and I saw things, did things." He touched the scar on his face unconsciously. "This isn't from the war. This is from a Cheyenne warrior who had every right to want me dead. But instead of killing me, he looked me in the eye and asked me my name." Martha felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went deeper than words. "He was dying," Samuel continued, "shot through the lung, and he used his last breath to ask me my name. Not to curse me, not to threaten me, but because he believed that even his enemy deserved to be seen as a human being." "What did you tell him?" "The truth. Samuel Reed from a little farm outside Kansas City, and then I asked him his name." Samuel's eyes met hers for the first time since he'd started talking. He said it was Joseph. Just Joseph. He'd taken a Christian name when he married a woman from the Indian school, thought it would help them be accepted. Martha reached across the table without thinking, her fingers barely touching the back of Samuel's hand. "What happened to him?" "He died holding my hand, asking me to tell his wife that her husband died as Joseph, not as some nameless savage." Samuel's voice broke slightly. "I spent 3 years looking for her after the war ended. Finally found her at a reservation in Kansas. Spent 2 days just sitting with her, telling her about her husband, about how brave he was, about how he died, thinking of her." The saloon around them seemed to fade away. Martha found herself leaning forward, drawn into Samuel's story, seeing him not as the stranger who had bought her, but as a man carrying his own heavy burden. "That's why you asked my name," she said. It wasn't a question. "Everyone deserves to be seen," Samuel said simply. "Everyone deserves to have their name spoken with respect, no matter what circumstances brought them to where they are." Martha felt tears threatening again. But these were different from the tears of humiliation she had shed on the platform. These were tears of recognition, of feeling understood for the first time in months. "I was a teacher," she said suddenly, "in Denver. I had my own schoolhouse, 23 students, and a little apartment above Mrs. Henderson's bakery. I saved every penny for 2 years to buy a small piece of land outside town. I was going to build a house, maybe start a school for children whose parents couldn't afford the city schools. What happened?" The story came pouring out of her, the railroad baron's son, Richard Hartwell, who wanted her land for a depot, the refused offers that turned into threats, the planted evidence that made her look like she'd stolen from the school fund, the trial where her word meant nothing against the Hartwell family's influence. "They gave me a choice," she said, her voice bitter. "Prison or this. Indentured servitude until I could pay back the money they claimed I stole. Money I never saw, never touched." Samuel's expression had grown dark as she talked. "How much did they claim you stole?" $57.30. Martha laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Enough to ruin my reputation, not enough to be worth anyone's while to investigate properly." "And they sentenced you to how long?" "However long it takes to work off the debt, plus interest, plus the cost of my trial and transportation." Martha met his eyes. "Sheriff Coleman told me it would probably be about 7 years, assuming I found someone willing to take me on and pay fair wages." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had told him. Outside, the afternoon was wearing on, and the saloon was starting to fill with the day shift from the failing silver mine. "Miss Jenkins," he said finally, "I have a proposition for you." Martha stiffened, suddenly remembering that this man had technically purchased her. "What kind of proposition?" "I own a small ranch about 5 miles south of here. Nothing fancy. A cabin, a barn, maybe 100 acres of decent grazing land. I've been trying to work it alone since I mustered out, but it's more than one person can handle." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I need help, and you need a way to earn enough to pay off this debt and get your life back. What if we helped each other?" "What exactly are you suggesting?" "An honest job for honest wages. You help me with the ranch work, cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, helping with the livestock, and I pay you a fair wage. More than fair. Enough that you could have this debt paid off in a year, maybe less." Martha studied his face, looking for the catch, the ulterior motive, but all she saw was sincerity and something that might have been hope. "Why would you do that? You don't know me. I could be a thief for all you know." Samuel smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him. "Miss Jenkins, I've met thieves, real ones, and I've learned to read people pretty well over the years. You're not a thief, you're just someone who got caught in a powerful man's way, and you think you can trust me." "I think," Samuel said, standing and extending his hand, "that Joseph taught me something about seeing people for who they really are, not who the world says they are. The question is, do you trust me enough to take the chance?" Martha looked at his outstretched hand, scarred, honest, offering not ownership but partnership. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something that might have been hope. She reached out and shook his hand. "When do we start?" The Reed Ranch sat in a small valley between 2 ridges, protected from the worst of the mountain winds, but open enough to catch the morning sun. As their wagon crested the final hill, Martha got her first look at what would be her home for the next year. A modest log cabin with a stone chimney, a red barn that had seen better days, and pastures where a small herd of cattle grazed peacefully. "It's not much," Samuel said, perhaps mistaking her silence for disappointment. "It's beautiful," Martha replied, and meant it. After months in jail cells and boarding house rooms, the sight of open space and endless sky made her heart lift for the first time in longer than she could remember. The cabin was sparse but clean. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, and 2 small bedrooms, separated by a heavy curtain. Samuel had already moved his belongings into the smaller room, leaving Martha the larger one, with the single window that looked out toward the mountains. "I know it's not what you're used to," he said, setting her small bundle of possessions on the rough wooden table. "But it's honest work and it's freedom." And over the following weeks, Martha threw herself into the routine of ranch life with a determination that surprised them both. She had been raised on a farm before her parents sent her east for teachers' training, and the skills came back to her like muscle memory. She cooked hearty meals on the wood stove, tended a garden that was recovering from Samuel's well-intentioned but inexpert care, and learned to help with the cattle. Samuel, for his part, proved to be exactly what he had seemed, an honest man trying to build an honest life. He worked from dawn to dusk, treating her not as a servant but as a partner. When she made mistakes, he taught her patiently. When she had ideas for improving things around the ranch, he listened and often implemented her suggestions. It was during their 3rd week together that the first real test came. Martha was hanging laundry behind the cabin when she heard horses approaching. Looking around the corner, she saw 3 men riding up to the front porch where Samuel was repairing a broken step. She recognized the lead rider immediately, Deputy Marshal Jake Thompson, Sheriff Coleman's right hand, and one of the crueler voices at her auction. "Afternoon, Reed," Thompson called out, dismounting with the swagger of a man who enjoyed his authority. "Heard you've been harboring a criminal out here." Samuel straightened slowly, his hammer still in his hand. Martha noticed that he positioned himself between the deputies and the cabin, though she doubted it was a conscious choice. "I'm harboring an employee," Samuel replied calmly. "Miss Jenkins is working off her debt just like the court ordered." "That's so?" Thompson's grin was unpleasant. "Well, we got a complaint. Seems some folks in town think maybe you two are getting a little too comfortable out here. Questions about what kind of work she's really doing, if you catch my meaning." Martha felt her face burn with anger and humiliation. She started to step forward, but Samuel's slight shake of the head stopped her. "The nature of Miss Jenkins' employment is honest ranch work," Samuel said, his voice level but with an undertone of steel that Martha hadn't heard before. "Anyone suggesting otherwise is welcome to discuss it with me directly." "Now don't go getting hostile, Reed," Thompson said, though his hand had moved closer to his gun. "We're just doing our job. Part of that job is making sure convicted criminals are being properly supervised." "She's supervised just fine," Samuel replied. "She works hard, follows the terms of her sentence, and minds her own business, which is more than I can say for whoever sent you out here with gossip and insinuation." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Martha could see Samuel's knuckles white around the hammer handle, could see the deputies sizing him up like predators, deciding whether their prey was worth the effort. That's when she made her decision. Stepping out from behind the cabin, Martha walked calmly to stand beside Samuel, not behind him, not in front of him, but beside him. "Deputy Thompson," she said, her voice carrying all the authority of her years in the classroom. "I'm glad you're here. I've been meaning to ask about the procedure for filing a complaint." Thompson's grin faltered. "What kind of complaint?" "About the conditions of my auction and sentencing," Martha replied smoothly. "You see, I've been reading the territorial law books that Mr. Reed has here." She gestured toward the cabin where Samuel did indeed have a small collection of legal texts, "and I've discovered some interesting inconsistencies." Samuel shot her a quick look, but played along. "Miss Jenkins has quite an eye for legal detail. For instance, Martha continued, warming to her theme, I was sentenced to indentured servitude to pay off a debt of $57.30, plus interest and court costs. But according to Territorial Statute 47B, any debt under $60 cannot result in a sentence of more than 6 months' labor. My sentence was open-ended. And Thompson's face had gone from red to pale. Martha could see him trying to work out whether she was bluffing. Furthermore, she pressed on, the auction itself appears to have violated Statute 52A, which requires that any public sale of labor contracts must include a clear statement of terms, duration, and the right of the contracted party to legal representation. I don't recall anyone mentioning my rights during the proceedings. Now see here, Thompson started. I'm not threatening anyone, Martha said quickly. I'm simply trying to understand my legal situation. Perhaps you could ask Sheriff Coleman to clarify these matters for me? I'd hate for there to be any irregularities. That might draw attention from the territorial authorities. The 3 deputies exchanged looks. Martha held her breath, hoping her improvised legal knowledge sounded more convincing than it felt. Finally, Thompson mounted his horse. We'll look into those matters, Miss Jenkins. In the meantime, you just make sure you're following the terms of your sentence. Of course, Martha replied pleasantly. I'm a law-abiding citizen. They rode off in a cloud of dust and mutual confusion. When they were gone, Samuel turned to Martha with something between admiration and amazement. Territorial Statute 47B? He asked. Martha grinned. I have no idea if there is a Territorial Statute 47B, but neither did they, and they were too proud to admit it. Samuel threw back his head and laughed, the first truly joyful sound Martha had heard from him. Miss Jenkins, you are full of surprises. Martha, she said firmly, after that performance, I think we can dispense with the formalities. Martha, then. Samuel's smile was warm and genuine, and for what it's worth, you handled that better than most soldiers I've known. As they watched the dust cloud disappear over the ridge, Martha felt something shift between them. They were no longer just a man who had bought a woman's contract and the woman trying to work off her debt. They were partners, allies, 2 people who had chosen to stand together against a world that seemed determined to grind them both down. Samuel, she said quietly, thank you. For standing with me. Thank you, he replied, for standing at all. A lot of people would have kept their heads down and hoped the trouble would pass. I spent 6 months keeping my head down, Martha said, watching the afternoon light paint the mountains gold. I think I'm done with that. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the stars come out, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced since before her world fell apart. The sense that she was exactly where she belonged. Winter came early to the Colorado Territory that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a fury that caught everyone by surprise. By November, the ranch was buried under 3 feet of snow, and Martha and Samuel found themselves effectively cut off from the outside world until spring. It should have been a time of hardship and privation. Instead, Martha found herself happier than she had been in years. The forced isolation meant long evenings by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. Samuel told her about his childhood on the Kansas farm, about the dreams he'd had before the war changed everything. Martha shared stories of her students in Denver, the small triumphs and daily joys of teaching that she had almost forgotten in the darkness of recent months. They worked together seamlessly now, their initial awkwardness replaced by the easy rhythm of 2 people who had learned to depend on each other. Samuel taught Martha to read the weather signs and track animals in the snow. Martha helped Samuel with the books, organizing his finances with the precision of an educated woman who understood numbers. More importantly, they had learned to simply be comfortable in each other's presence. Sometimes they would work for hours in companionable silence, each focused on their tasks, but aware of the other's presence, like a warm constant in the background of consciousness. It was during one of these quiet evenings in December that Samuel brought out a wooden box Martha had never seen before. "I've been thinking," he said, settling into the chair across from her by the fire. "About your debt situation." Martha looked up from the shirt she was mending. One of Samuel's, she realized with a start, though she couldn't remember when his clothes had started feeling like a natural part of her routine. "What about it?" Samuel opened the box and pulled out a small leather ledger and a stack of papers. "I've been keeping careful records of your wages, just like we agreed, and I think you'll be interested in the numbers." He handed her the ledger, and Martha felt her breath catch as she read the neat columns of figures. Samuel hadn't just been paying her fair wages. He had been paying her more than fair wages, more than many ranch hands would see in a year. "According to my calculations," Samuel said quietly, "you've already earned enough to pay off your original debt plus interest plus court costs. You've been a free woman for 2 months now." The ledger trembled in Martha's hands. Free. She was free to leave, free to go anywhere, free to start over wherever she chose. It was everything she had dreamed of during those dark months in jail, everything she had worked toward since coming to the ranch. So why did the thought of leaving feel like a knife in her chest? "I don't understand," she said slowly. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Because I was selfish," he said finally. "Because I've been happier these past months than I've been since before the war, and I didn't want it to end." Martha felt her heart start to race. "Samuel, I know it's not fair to you," he continued, still not looking at her. "You have every right to leave, to go back to teaching, to build the life you planned. I needed you to know that it's your choice, not because of debt or obligation or anything else. Your choice." Martha set the ledger aside and moved to kneel beside Samuel's chair. When she touched his hand, he finally looked at her, and she saw in his eyes the same fear and hope that was warring in her own heart. "What if I don't want to leave?" she asked softly. "Don't say that just because you feel obligated." "Samuel Reed," Martha interrupted firmly, "I have spent the better part of a year being told what I could and couldn't do, where I could and couldn't go, who I was and wasn't allowed to be. Don't you dare tell me that my own feelings are just obligation." Samuel searched her face, looking for certainty in her eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've built a life here, a good life, with a good man who saw me as a person when the rest of the world saw me as property." Martha felt tears starting, but they were good tears, clean tears. "I'm saying that I don't want to go back to Denver, back to teaching in a city where I'll always be the woman who was disgraced. I want to stay here with you and build something real." "Martha, are you sure? Really sure? Because if you stay, I want it to be forever, not as my employee, not as someone working off a debt, but as my partner, my wife, if you'll have me." The proposal hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Martha thought of all the conventional reasons she should say no. They had known each other only a few months. She was still technically a convicted criminal. People would talk, people would judge. Then she thought of Samuel asking her name on that humiliating day at the auction block. She thought of his gentle hands removing the burlap sack, of his patient teaching and honest partnership. She thought of evenings by the fire and mornings working side by side, of the way he had stood with her against the deputies, of the way he had given her back her freedom without expecting anything in return. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it. To partnership, to marriage, to forever." Samuel's smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms. "Are you prepared for the scandal? A war veteran marrying a convicted thief?" Martha laughed, feeling giddy with joy and possibility. "Are you prepared for the scandal? A convicted thief marrying a man too honorable for his own good?" "I think we can weather any scandal," Samuel said, "as long as we weather it together." They were married in the spring by a traveling preacher who didn't ask too many questions about Martha's past. The only witnesses were a neighboring rancher and his wife, good people who had come to respect both Samuel's integrity and Martha's determination. Martha had worried that the townspeople would boycott their small celebration, but she had underestimated the power of Samuel's reputation and her own quiet dignity. Sheriff Coleman attended, looking uncomfortable but dutiful. Even Deputy Thompson came, though he kept his distance and left early. But the moment that mattered most came after the ceremony, when Samuel took her hand and spoke the words that had started everything between them. "Martha Reed," he said, using her new name like a promise. "I see you, all of you, and I'm proud to stand beside you for whatever comes next." Martha squeezed his hand, thinking of the long journey that had brought them both to this moment. His path through war and guilt, hers through injustice and humiliation, both of them finding redemption in the simple act of seeing each other as fully human. "Samuel Reed," she replied, "you gave me back my name when the world had forgotten it. Now I give you my heart, my future, and my promise to stand with you no matter what storms we face." As they walked back to their ranch, their home, Martha realized that the woman who had stood on that auction block with a sack over her head was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had learned that dignity couldn't be bought or sold, only claimed and defended. Behind them, the setting sun painted the Colorado mountains gold and crimson, and ahead of them stretched years of honest work, quiet love, and the deep satisfaction of a life built on respect, partnership, and the radical act of seeing each other truly. The auction had lasted less than an hour. The love it had accidentally created would last a lifetime.